Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Greetings. Thanks so much for joining us in the Word today as Dr. Roberts and I continue exploring a fascinating chapter from 1 Kings. Yes. Chapter 8 of 1 Kings describes the dedicatory events surrounding the completion of the temple.
Right. And as we saw last week, it was the connection of the ark and the tabernacle in the temple, which now makes one location for the worship of Israel.
It's all coming together finally. The tabernacle, the tent of meeting, was built as a worship site intentionally to be moved from place to place during the 40 years of their journey from Sinai down in the southern peninsula there up to the promised land of Canaan. And even after they got to Canaan, that worship tent kind of stayed on the move a little bit.
Yes, it was mobile.
It was still mobile. But now the time has come when a permanent building, a temple, has been approved by God, and it will be placed in Jerusalem, which had been picked out as a destination long before this time, but it finally is coming there. So the whole tradition of the tabernacle and what's going to become the tradition of the temple kind of merge at this moment in history.
Right.
Yeah. And we also get to see Solomon at his best here, I think, don't you?
Yes. There are times later that are not so good, but right now he's...
right now we can say he's got some good sensibilities about things and has picked up some good attitudes from his father, David. There are going to be times when we just shake our heads and wonder, but at the wrong things that he does, but for now it's a good moment. Well, this idea of dedication, I don't know how many of our viewers have been involved in the dedications of buildings or not, but they're interesting events. I can remember when the congregation I grew up in moved from a little white frame wooden church that seated about 150 people to a large stone beautiful building, a permanent building on the same site, pretty much, that seated about 350 people. And we began at the old church building and started the service there, and there was an invocation, and we sang a song, and then the minister invited everybody to stand up. And we took a hymnal. There's an old hymn, "We Would Be Building." I don't know if anybody knows that one, but we all turned to that. And so the minister and his wife walked down the aisle, and the choir went behind them, and then the elders and their families, and then the whole congregation just filed out. And we wound our way through the cemetery over to the new building. And finished singing the hymn in the new building and had the rest of the service there. So it was a very memorable, I was only 8 years old when it happened. It was a very memorable moment. So this surely was a memorable moment for them as well. So this is the dedicatory address. Now, the first 13 verses of chapter 8 we talked about in the previous lesson. And let's remember what was going on there.
Well, it might be good to talk about Kings as a whole. And
get the whole first 7 chapters. All right, let's do that. Chapter 1, Solomon becomes king. David is still alive, but he's feeble.
And there's some question, is he going to be the king? But he assumes that role and with David's blessing, and he eliminates a brother that was challenging him.
And then Solomon, as the new young king, gets some good advice from David, spiritual advice to begin with. Make sure whatever you do, you obey God. And then some political advice, which is eliminate your enemies.
Some of the problem people.
He has him eliminate David's enemies, who David didn't eliminate. But he knows that Solomon can't stand up against them. Then we see Solomon doing some of his best work as king, organizing the nation administratively in chapters 2 through 4. And he does well
And
at
his
that.
wisdom shows up in
Yes,
the early parts.
chapter 3,
Yeah.
we get to see his wisdom and how that's played out in his political decisions as well. Then chapters 5 through 7 are another great positive accomplishment, and that's all his building projects. He seems to have just been a great builder.
Yeah. The temple, of course, we focus, but he also built a huge palace for himself and many fortresses around the country to kind of solidify the defense system.
Right. And like his father before him, he imported a lot of cedar wood from up north in Lebanon. But his buildings seem to have been just absolutely gorgeous. This temple, even though it was not a massive building, as temples go, must have been quite lovely, good proportions. Beautifully decorated.
And ornate. And it's significant to maybe say at this point, it didn't have to be big because the whole nation didn't gather inside the temple. The priests were there in there to do the sacrificial work. But the people would gather in the courtyard around it and recognize that what was happening there was what made them who they were, and that was the focus of their worship.
Yeah, that word focus is a good word because people would come to the temple as individuals or families and bring their sacrifices. They didn't gather at a prescribed time, and there were no chairs or anything. So it's not a corporate worship center in the way we think of a church building or even a synagogue.
Right.
It wasn't like a synagogue. So it was individual in a way, but it was the focal point for all the worship of the individual Jews as well.
In the book of Psalms,
Israelites, I should
later, probably the second temple, but maybe early, the songs of ascent were when people were gathering toward the temple, and there were songs that they would sing together.
Making their journey as they approached it. Yeah. So that's a good reminder of the nature of the worship that's going on there. Now, this is a corporate event, though, this dedication.
Yeah.
And so they're not standing so much or sitting inside the temple the way we would think of a church building or a synagogue, but they are gathered around it where they can see.
Yeah, and last week's lesson, we had Solomon facing the ark as it was presented, and the people behind him facing the same direction.
So he's kind of with the people at that point, one of them, and God's presence, symbolized by the ark, is the focus.
Yeah.
But here, now, is when he turns and addresses the people. So from now on, he's kind of presiding at the event. Well, let's read this next section of chapter 8 then, starting in verse 14. While the whole assembly of Israel was standing there, the king turned around and blessed them. Then he said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his own hand has fulfilled what he promised with his own mouth to my father David. For he said, since the day I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city in any tribe of Israel to have a temple built so that my name might be there. But I have chosen David to rule my people Israel. My father David had it in his heart to build a temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, you did well to have it in your heart to build a temple for my name. Nevertheless, you are not the one to build the temple, but your son, your own flesh and blood. He is the one who will build the temple for my name. The Lord has kept the promise he made. I have succeeded David my father, and now I sit on the throne of Israel just as the Lord promised. And I have built the temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. I have provided a place there for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our ancestors when he brought them out of Egypt."
Very good.
So this whole assembly, all the gathered people are there, and as verse 14 says, the king now turns to to become the front and center person rather than one of the crowd.
And when it says the whole assembly, it's obviously not the entire population all in one place, but the representatives of the entire nation are there, so that assembly, in a sense, is the whole nation.
Yeah, a representative of them. And the first thing it says is that he wanted to bless his people. Normally, we think of priests as doing blessing of people, but there are several occasions in the Old Testament where other than priests do that. David, in an earlier lesson from Chronicles of some weeks ago, blessed the people, and Solomon is doing the same thing here. But his first words that are quoted here in verse 15 are not a blessing of the people, are they?
He blesses the Lord.
Yeah, which is probably not a bad reminder, is it? That we begin
good way to start.
We begin our communication with a consciousness of God and our desire to bless God, to say a good word about God, as it were.
Yeah.
In the NIV, it says, blessed them in verse 14, then praise be to the Lord, a different verb, English verb, in verse 15. But I think it's interesting to note that the Hebrew words are the same.
Bless the Lord.
Bless the Lord, yeah. So he blessed them, the people, and began by blessing the Lord. It's the same word, barak, like that character back in the Book of Judges, barak. That's the word there.
And we'll see next week's lesson a whole lot of what's called anthropomorphism, where God is referred to as though he had a body, hands, mouth, and so forth. And right in this same verse, speaks about his own hand and his own mouth. And it's not saying that God physically has a body like we do.
Right.
But the only way we can understand the way God has entered into our lives is by expressing it in these terms.
Yes. We only have one point of reference, and that is human existence. We only have one language, that's human language, and so we know that we're using terribly limited language. But the mistake would be, there's nothing wrong with that. The mistake is that limiting the nature of God, assuming that God's nature is determined by our language or perception of Him.
Our conception of God needs to be larger than how we can express it.
Exactly. And we also need to think of this language as metaphorical language, therefore. So when we talk about the hand of God, we're not affirming that God has a physical hand, but we're talking about the power of God, or the work of God, or the deeds of God. And what about the mouth? What would that?
Well, the fact
mouth
that
of God.
God has spoken. This is from God. There's no question.
Yeah, God finds ways of communicating with God's people, and we talk about that metaphorically as the mouth of God.
Yeah,
we're not saying that God has a physical mouth.
But the subsequent verse where he begins to talk about bringing the people out of Egypt is remembering their history, and their history is not just national experiences. It's the awareness that God acted in history to do something to make us a people and bring us to where we are today, and that's really what has formed our occasion today. That awareness of God acting in history and making this happen.
We talked in a recent lesson about the fact that these, what we call history books, were put in a section of the Hebrew Old Testament that they called prophets.
The former prophets.
Yeah. And how that showed us that the Israelites were aware that God communicated not only through prophetic utterance, but through his interaction with human beings in human history. And Solomon is affirming that here as well.
And the exodus from Egypt, throughout the entire Old Testament, from that point on, is a touchstone that's constantly referred to. Because it's the evidence, there's no question about, that God called them as a people, brought them in, made them who they are. And that even into the New Testament, they'll continue to mention that.
The exodus from Egypt, and then the subsequent event of their establishment as a nation at Sinai, which only took place about 3 months apart. But that cluster of events was not the beginning of God's covenant with Israel.
No, he made the covenant earlier.
Yeah, the beginning goes back at least to the time of Abraham.
Yeah.
But it is kind of a fulcrum, it's kind of a turning point, kind of a tipping point. So the history of the covenant up until then climaxed there in a way, and then everything that took place afterwards followed from that high point.
And when you think about the generations and even centuries that they had been in Egypt, they'd been in a pagan environment.
Over 400
right,
years.
with no remembrance, no specific connection to that promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so when they came out in the Exodus and at Sinai, God gave them the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, the rituals that they had, the Sabbath observances, all those things.
The priestly.
It was all set up
Yeah.
to remind them of the covenant relationship and to keep them focused. So there's no question that was something they kept looking back to.
Right. Yeah, their whole religious life and the parameters of their relationship with God were established then, even though the beginnings were back with the promise to Abraham.
And we were talking this morning that, you keep hearing the same story, and you think, well, I've heard this, we know this. But it's sort of like the old gospel song, I love to tell the story. Those who know it best are hungry and thirsty to hear it like the rest.
Yeah.
We need to hear it again.
So it's true of the prophets as well. They frequently appeal back to the time of the Exodus.
Yes.
And we see it even in the early Christian community. That great address by Stephen to the Sanhedrin, the Christian servant Stephen, in chapter 7 of the book of Acts, looks back to Israelite history, where the Exodus is very prominent and Moses is very prominent. So that's why. And we have, you mentioned out of Egypt in verse 16, but he's going to say it again down in verse 21, right in this short lesson text that we have here today. He appeals to the memory of the Exodus twice.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for doing that. Now, I love the contrast that he sets up in verse 16. Out of Egypt, since the day I brought my people out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city in any tribe to have a temple. Of course, that's all changed now. There is a city, Jerusalem, where the temple has been built, and now temple worship is being inaugurated. But what he goes on to say, the beautiful contrast, I have not chosen a city, a place, but I have chosen David to rule my people. Now that's interesting to me. That it's kind of like when David wanted to build a temple, and God, through the prophet Nathan, responds by saying, well, what makes you think I need a temple? You know, I've had a tabernacle all this time, and I
never needed it.
I never complained or never asked for anything better. What's the big deal? So here he says, it's not like I've been going around saying, oh, we got to find a city for my temple, my temple, my temple. There's no reference to that. But he did raise up a godly leader. In David.
And the covenant that he made with David, that his family would be a house, a dynasty, that Davidic covenant became significant in the time of their exile, especially, when they don't have a temple, they don't have a land, but they do have the promise that there's going to be a king, there's going to be a time, and that was part of what they were looking forward to. So that Davidic covenant was significant.
Yeah.
But David had it in his heart to build a temple for the name of the Lord.
That's an interesting phrase, and it's one that Solomon just loves because the word name appears in verse 16, name of the Lord in 17, name in verse 18, 19, on and on and on. We don't have to count them.
Yeah.
So what do you think Solomon meant by that phrase, the name of the Lord?
Well, we've mentioned before that name is not just a title, but it's the nature, the character, the identity of a person. But it's also from ancient times, when someone knew a name, they had some degree of connection, even control, Adam was told to name the beasts and the animals and so forth. And Jacob wrestling with the man in the night, tell me your name.
Right.
And Jacob's name was changed because the man had the control to, the angel perhaps had the control to change his name. Moses at the bush said, who shall I say has sent me? Who shall I say? And God tells him his name, which that's giving humans a connection to God, that personal name, that sacred name that later on they would not even pronounce or write. They hesitated about it. But it was that relationship with God. So the name is really important.
And so here it's a standing in for the person of God, and your emphasis, which is so good, is that it's what connects the people, gives them access or a connection to the person of God and to the nature of God. And to Solomon's credit, he gets that this temple now is going to become a focal point for a more personal relationship with God. Well, he reminds the people that his father David, who was the greatest of the kings in many ways, had indeed wanted to build a temple, and he reminds them that that was his intention, and that it was a good intention, that the intention was honored by God. The word is heart in verse 17, but heart
His will.
Is will, purpose, intention. So it's like saying David intended to build a temple. David had as his purpose to build a temple. And according to Solomon, God approved that intention. He approved his goal, even though he declined to let David be the one who did it.
We don't have that quote otherwise, but that's what Solomon...
No, but Solomon understood it that way, and it could be that David had developed that impression that God approved of his intention.
And we see it in subsequent events.
And David may have communicated that to Solomon. But your son, your own flesh and blood, that flesh and blood is a modernized version of out of your loins is the actual expression. A son from your very loins, he will build the temple for my name. By the way, every time the word temple is used in this passage, it's the Hebrew word house. And we've talked in previous lessons about how they love that word house because it has so many interesting connotations. But here it does mean temple. Now in verses 20 and 21, Solomon does turn his attention a little bit from what God has done. That's still in the picture. And what David had purposed to what Solomon, had accomplished.
A little bit of ego slips in.
A little bit. There's not too much braggadocio here, but he does talk about his accomplishments. He says at the end of 20, I have built the temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. So I finally accomplished what God willed and David intended.
He starts off saying, the Lord has kept the promise he made. And I thought, we've had an emphasis a few years back about promise keepers. This is promise keeper number one. God has kept his promise.
God is the original promise keeper. Okay. The second thing that I don't want to say Solomon brags about, but does credit himself with, besides building the temple, is bringing the ark. And we do need to remember that's how chapter 8 began, with the bringing of the ark and the furniture.
And that Ark of the Covenant, that was the box that was containing the tablets of stone on which the Ten Commandments were written, and a jar of manna and the rod of Aaron that Moses had used that were there at one time and then not there later. But that ark had been used in the time of Saul almost as a good luck charm, some kind of a magic sign.
Kind of a talisman almost.
To get them a victory in battle, and they lost the battle and lost the ark. The Philistines had it for a while and then brought it back or sent it back, and it was just left off in the margins of the country, not really used or considered at all, until David came to Jerusalem and left the tabernacle in the north where it was, but brought the ark to Jerusalem. And then when the temple is built, Solomon brings the two together, tabernacle and ark.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the connection point
Yeah.
of that.
And that's what's significant about this temple and the dedication of the temple that's here as well. The phrase in verse 21 is interesting. I have provided a place there for the ark, that there meaning in the temple, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our fathers when he brought them out of Egypt. I think there are two ways to think about that, in which is the covenant. He may be thinking specifically of the tablets of the Ten Commandments, which kind of were the core of the law, and the law was the definition of the broader relationship.
Yeah.
But he may be using the word covenant in its broadest sense, that is this mutual relationship between God and God's people, and saying that the ark is the symbol and as a box of this whole covenant relationship, which was started with Abraham but reached kind of a climax at the time at Sinai. So, or maybe both.
Yeah, and that's going to show up, I think, more in the next lesson we'll have next week, because as Solomon blessed the people, and there are more specifics of how that blessing came out, he kept talking about when you pray toward this temple, when you look to this temple, and it wasn't that the building was magic, but it was a symbol of that relationship they have with God.
Yeah. So the ark is a symbol, the whole temple in a way is the symbol of their relationship with God that we call covenant. Well, what sense does this historical moment of dedication make for Christians like us? What do we have to gain from this, do you think?
Well, I think as the ark was in the temple for the right relationship of the people with God, so the new covenant we've got needs to be in our hearts as we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 refers to that. And when we have God's covenant relationship with us deep in our hearts, that's when we're in the right relationship and focused in the right direction as the people of Israel were.
I like that. This passage also made me think about the fact that just as God wasn't all that obsessed with finding a city or a place to build a temple for himself, but instead was more focused on choosing a person to lead his people. That's a good reminder to me to resist the temptation to think of the church as a building, as a place to which we go. I get it that we have places of meeting, but to remember that the church is people. I mean, one of the things I learned when I was 3 years old is here's the church, here's the steeple, here's all the people. Okay, it's the people that you end up with. But it's important, I think, to resist the temptation to. Our language naturally falls into talking about the church as a place.
But we see that especially in our focus being in a person of Jesus.
Good point. Good point. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today. We got some good insights and good reminders out of this lesson regarding the dedication of the temple by Solomon. We've got 2 more weeks in this chapter 8. Hope you can join us for those as well. We'll see you then.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.